How do we get the sharpest possible photos with the gear we have? This isn't about going out and spending thousands on a new lens or cranking those sharpness sliders all the way up. This is about using the gear we have and maximizing its potential and getting it right in camera. An evolution from the exposure triangle, we're going to call this the Sharpness Diamond, taking into account the factors that make up a sharp photo. Starting with shutter speed, because excessive motion blur in photos will kill any chances of us even getting a sharp photo before any other factors are even taken into account. There are two factors that introduce motion blur into our photos, one of those coming from the camera side. If there's excessive movement in the camera when we're taking photos, it will induce motion blur throughout the entire frame. The best way to combat this is either put it on a tripod, monopod, or ensure when we're hand holding that we hold it excessively still. The second factor is subject motion, and this can vary greatly depending on what type of subject we're shooting. But once we ensure that we're controlling the camera motion from our side as best as possible, we can control the subject's motion in the frame by using shutter speed. So how do we get the correct shutter speed? Well, it's a difficult question to answer because every situation is different and it really varies greatly depending on the subject that you're shooting. If you're shooting fast birds in flight, obviously you need a faster shutter speed. While if you're shooting a bird perched in a tree or sitting wildlife, you can get away with a slower shutter speed. One thing to consider that is not talked about as much is the distance to your subject and how that affects what you need for your shutter speed to freeze motion. I think the best way to explain this is imagine standing next to a busy road and watching cars go by. And then just imagine how far are those cars moving within your field of view over a given period of time. Now, if you're to back up a considerable distance, maybe say 100 meters, and watch those same cars, you would get a much smaller movement over time in your field of view, giving you less motion within the frame. The same factors apply in wildlife. If subjects are closer to you, movements are more pronounced in the field of view, as opposed to subjects that are far away. So your shutter speed tends to have to be higher when you're shooting subjects that are closer as opposed to further away. The goal with shutter speed is almost always just to get it fast enough to freeze motion within the frame, and then adjust for exposure if needed. And the reason for this is going faster on your shutter speed really doesn't get you anything past a certain point. And at that point, you're typically taking away from your exposure and harming other settings and other factors that can cause your photo not to be as sharp. The next factor we're going to pay attention to is our ISO, and that is because higher ISO values do introduce noise into the photos. And yes, noise does reduce the perceived sharpness of our photos. I'm aware that there's plenty of AI denoise tools out there nowadays, and they're great tools when they're absolutely needed. But we're talking about getting it right in camera, and I like to avoid using those as much as possible. The takeaway from that is, and it's pretty obvious, is just keep your ISO values as low as possible when you're balancing out with your other settings. And this will help reduce the noise in your photos and have a cleaner image. Aperture is another setting that we can use to help control our chances of getting sharp photos. And that's not just because aperture controls our depth of field and is used to help control exposure. It's because almost every lens has a sweet spot. The sweet spot of a lens can vary greatly from lens to lens, so it's worth taking the time to look up your specific lens online, look at some sharpness charts, and see where its sharpest points are within the aperture range. In some lenses, this is more pronounced than others, but we're looking to squeeze every ounce of performance out of the gear we have. So taking the time to figure out where your lens's sweet spot is can help you get a little sharper photos. Something that's often overlooked, and we did briefly touch on it a little bit before, is the distance to our subject. The further you are away from your subject, the more chance that heat distortion, haze, and light refraction through the atmosphere has a chance to take place. While it may not seem like it has a huge impact at first, at extreme distances and extreme conditions, that kind of distortion throughout the air can completely ruin any chances of getting a sharp photo and make it almost impossible. The important thing to remember here is just to be aware that certain atmospheric conditions can cause degradation in the photo and loss in sharpness. And at the end of the day, the best thing you can do when you're in those type of conditions is just get as close to your subject as possible, because you're not going to win against physics and science. There's one more factor that I didn't include in the Sharpness Diamond because it's not necessarily a setting or something that we can control in varying degrees, but it does have a massive impact on the sharpness of our photos, and that's focus. Missed focus, whether that's slightly behind or in front of our intended focus point, can many times lead us to incorrectly blame the lens for not being sharp. A slightly out of focus image will be very soft and doesn't look very sharp. I know it seems very obvious, but making sure that we have our subject in focus is a massive component when it comes to ensuring we get sharp photos. Before we blame our equipment for not being as sharp or accurate as we think it should be, we need to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to give it the best chance of success by using the correct settings. We need to make sure that we choose the correct focus mode for what we're trying to shoot. And nowadays with mirrorless cameras, eye tracking is amazing and works great in most situations. But there are a lot of times that that auto eye tracking kind of falls a little short, especially when it comes to busy backgrounds, high contrast in the scene. It can tend to get confused and sometimes focus on the wrong part of the scene, leading to an out of focus image. Sometimes you just have to go back to Old Faithful's single point autofocus and manually pick where you want it to focus within the scene. I would recommend setting your camera up with some custom controls so that you can quickly switch between different focus area modes. Just so when you see the camera starting to get a little confused, you can step in and override it and fine-tune your setting. Before I switched over to mirrorless and shot on DSLRs, I typically shot in group area focus modes with a button to quickly switch to single point autofocus if I needed to really punch in and dial it in. But now on mirrorless, we have these amazing eye tracking that can do a lot of this for us. But the downside of that, it tends to make us a little lazy and not really pay attention to what's going on with the focus. Sometimes we do need to override that. In a perfect world, we'd always shoot at a high enough shutter speed to completely eliminate motion blur, while keeping our ISO values as low as possible to eliminate noise, always shooting at our lens's sweet spot, and then getting as close to our subject as possible while maintaining tack sharp focus. The reality is though, you're going to have to compromise in most situations. If you want the sharpest photos possible with the gear you currently have, it really just comes down to understanding how all these factors play in, because that understanding will allow you to properly prioritize in different situations. There is no one setting to rule them all and no perfect setting for all situations. Photography is all about balance and setting ourselves up for the most probable chance of success.